Hi you guys, welcome to my kitchen. I will show you the basics of gluten-free sourdough baking. We will talk about gluten-free sourdough starter, what it is, how to make bread. I will show you everything step by step. Alright, so let's start with a starter. Starter is what serves as yeast in gluten-free bread. While commercial yeast is great, not everyone can process and digest it very well. So growing your own gluten-free starter can actually be beneficial for your health, or it also can just make your bread taste better. So here is my starter. I keep it in a glass bowl like this because I use a lot of it for my bread. So a starter is basically water and flour that is fermented over time, and good bacteria grows and develops, and then eventually it serves as leavening agent for your bread. But when you start growing your starter, you don't need a huge bowl like this, because we will start little by little. We will use a jar like this. It's important that you use something made of glass, and if you use anything that is not see-through, you might not be able to see the progress that you have, which is super helpful. You want to see the bubbles, how much it's rising, very helpful. Definitely get a glass jar. Then we want to cover the starter to prevent it from drying and to prevent flies and dirt and dust from getting into it. So I use a cheesecloth like this to cover my starter. And then you want to use a rubber band to fix the cheesecloth on top of the jar, like this. This way the air can still come through, and it's important for bacteria to get some air. Then you probably will need one more rubber band like this, just to keep looking at the levels of your starter where it's growing. You also need a stirring tool, which you can use any spoon or fork or knife in your kitchen. Then you want a digital kitchen scale. If you don't want to use a scale, that's fine. You can use cups. But if in case you have, dense bread, or the crumb is not as you want it to be, the first advice you'll probably get from me and others is use a scale. So those are the basic tools that you need to grow a starter. Pretty simple. Then what else do you need? You need water and flour. I use brown rice flour because it is whole grain, so it's good for bacteria. I would recommend using either brown rice. You can also use chickpea flour, buckwheat flour, millet, sorghum, plenty of other different types that you can get a fuller list. In the comments below, I'll post a fuller list, or you can also go to our Facebook group, and there people will tell you their experience with different flours. Then there's water. I keep the water in a jar like this so that I can always have it at room temperature. If you use cold water, your bacteria is not going to work as fast, and they won't be as active. They'll be slow and frozen a little bit. And if you use super hot water, you might kill your bacteria. All right, so that's what we will need for a starter. Now let's look at the process. So first of all, on the first day, we will add 20 grams of flour and 20 grams of water. You want your starter to be like thick paste consistency. It shouldn't be too runny. It shouldn't be crumbly. If it is too runny, it's not going to rise. If it is too crumbly, it's not going to ferment either. And 100% hydration means that you're using 100% of water to flour. So meaning that if you're using 20 grams of flour, you're going to use 20 grams of water. That is called 100% hydration. And then we cover our starter with the cheesecloth and put a rubber band on it to make sure that it's fixed on the jar. If you don't have a cheesecloth, you can use a lid. Just put it on loosely so that air still can come through potentially. Then we just leave the starter for 24 hours and see what happens next. After 24 hours, you take your starter again and you look at it. Are there bubbles? If you see that there are some bubbles on the bottom of it, then the fermentation started, which means that now you can start discarding your starter and adding extra flour and water. Discarding, it means that you will just take half of the starter and put it in a separate jar, and you can use that later. And Feeding the starter means that you will add fresh flour and water to help maintain it and give it more food to continue growing its strength. If your starter is not showing any activity after 24 hours, leave it for 24 more hours to ferment. The reason for this could be cold temperature in your house. It might take longer time for bacteria to develop, but it should show some activity later on. At this point, once you start seeing activity and bubbles in your starter, you can just go on and every single day discard half of it and add 20 grams of flour and water for the next 7 to 14 days. Once you see that your starter is bubbling consistently for a week or two, you can start making bread with it. Very important to remember that your starter might not double. It's not going to double unless you feed it 2 or 3 times a day, which is fine. You can feed it 2 or 3 times a day. Just you will end up with a lot of discard and it might be a lot of work. I don't feed my starter 2 or 3 times a day. Once you think your starter is ready, it's been at least 7 to 10 days and your starter is bubbly and happy, you can start growing it to be ready to make bread, growing in amount. Now you only have a little bit of starter on the bottom of the jar, and in order to bring it to this amount of starter, you need to add about 150 grams of flour and 150 grams of water and mix it and let it sit. That's okay to feed your starter more than what is in the jar. So let's say you have a jar with 20 grams of flour and water and you feed it 150 of it each. That's totally fine because the starter will work through it. It will just take it a little bit more time. Then once you see that the starter has risen to its full capacity and it's about to start falling down, you will get a feel for it. Over time you will kind of get a feel for when it's at its peak activity. At first it's hard to tell, is it going to keep rising, is it going to fall soon? But over time you'll get an idea of how high it normally gets. That's when you want to use it for bread, because that's when the bacteria is most active and strong. Once the starter starts falling down, but some bacteria starts dying. Once you made your bread, you can keep the starter in the fridge until next time you will use it. I use my starter every day, so I keep it at room temperature at all times. But if you only bake bread once a week, feed your starter 150 grams flour and water or less. That's fine. If let's say you made bread and you have a little bit of starter left, you can feed it, like 20 to 50 grams, put it in the fridge and maintain it once a week. Discard and feed once a week until you're ready to bake. When you're ready to bake, take the starter outside of the fridge and feed it. Now feed it a lot, 150 of each at least, so that you have enough of starter to make bread. You can keep it at room temperature for a couple days before you bake, or you can do it the day you want to bake. The longer you keep it at room temperature, the stronger and more active the bacteria will be, but it's fine to bake the first day you take it out of the fridge as well. So now let's talk about the tools you need to make a gluten-free sourdough bread. The first thing you want to have is a Dutch oven. A Dutch oven is a cast iron pot. It can be big or small. It is fairly heavy and it is important that it's made of cast iron. On the inside, it can be either enameled or not, but it is better to use not enameled Dutch oven for bread baking. I made a mistake of getting an enameled one, and now the enameling, it became brown, and you can see that it looks ugly. I can't really wash it off, but I still use it for bread baking. I put a baking paper in it so it doesn't impact my bread in any ways. So the reason for using a Dutch oven is because it heats up very well, and then it also allows for steam that raises your bread eventually. But if you don't have a Dutch oven, that's fine. You will probably benefit from getting one because it will serve you for the rest of your life. It doesn't go bad. Even if it gets covered with rust, you can scratch off the rust and then season your Dutch oven and use it. But if you don't want to use one, or you can't, or you just want to try making this bread and you're not sure if you want to keep doing it, you can use simple sheet pan, but you will need to add water to the bottom of your oven so that you create some steam for your bread. It's not as great as having a Dutch oven, but it works. Another special tool for gluten-free sourdough specifically is a banneton basket. So a banneton basket is basically a basket for proofing, for letting your bread ferment. And it comes in all shapes and sizes. I have one like this and one like this, and I got way too big banneton for gluten-free sourdough bread because generally gluten-free sourdough is not as big as regular sourdough because it needs to be smaller to bake through. So when you are buying a banneton basket, get a smaller one, or you will need to pre-shape it before baking like I do. This is not necessary to make bread. You can also use a mixing bowl. You can use a bowl like this and put a kitchen towel inside and then let your bread ferment in a mixing bowl. Another special tool you want to have is a digital scale, like we mentioned before. So those are the basic tools. Of course, you will also need a mixing bowl, a whisk, a spatula, all those things that you probably already have in your kitchen. Now let's go over the ingredients. Ingredients are pretty simple. All you need is gluten-free flour, preferably a couple of types, starches, water. Again, water at room temperature, preferably slightly warm. If it is warm, then bacteria will work better. Then you will also need psyllium husk. Psyllium husk is something that we use in gluten-free baking to recreate gluten that will keep our bread together, make it flexible. Psyllium husk has 3 types. The first one is whole husks, the second one is powder, and the third one is very fine powder. I prefer using whole husks or simple powder versus very fine powder because very fine powder clumps in water. It needs more time to hydrate, and if you add it to dry ingredients, it takes even more time to hydrate. Plus, it turns my bread purple if I use a little bit too much than I should have. So I rather recommend using regular powder or whole husks. Then another thing we will need is salt and sugar. All right, now let's look at what gluten-free sourdough bread process looks like. First, you will need to make psyllium gel. To make psyllium gel, add psyllium husk to water and whisk it so that it doesn't form any clumps. Then let it sit for a couple of minutes. In the meantime, we will mix our flours. I add some brown rice flour, some millet flour, starches, then we'll add some sugar and salt and mix it to make sure that it's all incorporated. Then our psyllium gel is ready by now. See how it is, how it looks like gel now. Now we will add our psyllium gel and our gluten-free sourdough starter to the bowl with flour and mix it. You can use your hands to mix the dough, or you can also use a stand mixer with a dough hook or a hand mixer. If you use a mixer, your dough will be smoother. But I normally use my hands because it is faster and simpler and doesn't require any dishwashing afterwards. So once your dough is incorporated, you can turn it over onto your working surface. You can flour it a little bit to prevent sticking and pre-shape it into a round loaf. Then transfer it to a banneton basket that we will flour. Be generous with flouring your banneton so that the bread doesn't stick to it. Then cover your dough with a kitchen towel and let it ferment for anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, depending on how warm it is in your house. Or you can also place it in the refrigerator and let it ferment overnight. When your bread is ready, preferably before that, you want to start preheating your oven. Take your dough, turn it over onto a working surface and pre-shape it. Then score the bread. Scoring means cutting the bread on the surface in order to direct the steam that is going to escape from the dough. And it can also create a nice pattern for you, for your bread. Then place the bread carefully into the Dutch oven and bake it for 30 to 40 minutes. After the first stage of baking, take the Dutch oven, take the lid off, and take the bread out. Lower the temperature to 400 Fahrenheit or 200 Celsius and continue baking for another 30 to 60 minutes, depending on how crusty you want your bread to be. But if your bread turns out gummy on the inside, that means that you probably underbaked it. If it is really gummy, then you underbaked it. If it is slightly gummy, You can lower the amount of water you use next time, but generally gluten-free bread is a little bit gummier. And once the bread is ready, take it out and let it cool completely. Just make sure that it's not warm to the touch anymore. And once your bread is cooled down, you can cut it and then store it either at room temperature or in the freezer. Don't put it in the fridge because that will make it a little bit harder. I prefer to slice my bread and put it in the freezer so that every time I want to eat it, then I'll take a few pieces out, put it in the microwave, and then it's fresh, versus leaving it on the kitchen counter. It might actually get crusty and a little bit hard. These are the basics of making gluten-free sourdough bread. It is actually fairly simple and even simpler than making regular sourdough bread. You should join our Facebook group for advice and success sharing. If you have any questions, if your bread is not turning out the way you would like it to, there are plenty of people who will help you understand what exactly is going on, and I'm more than happy to chat with you and see what troubles you're having, or if you just need some encouragement in your baking journey. Thank you for watching this basic overview of what gluten-free sourdough baking looks like, and I'm excited to see you in our group to hear how it is going for you and know if you have any questions.